And we're recording. Well, welcome everybody to our first ever virtual installment of Last Sunday program. I want to start off by just saying how much I very much wish that we were all together at the Interpretive Center, listening to one of our great speakers in the Valley, Richard Hart. And I want to also give a thanks to Eric Burr, who was scheduled for this slot, and we will hopefully see him again in October. But as with everything in the coronavirus era, we've had to adjust things. So I want to say thank you to Richard for being able to step in last minute, literally agreeing this week to it, and offering up a very poignant and appropriate topic that we will get to in just a second. So most of you probably know Richard already, but I'll give just a little biography. Richard, he provides historical, ethnohistorical, and environmental historical services and expert testimony for North American Indian tribes. He's the former director of the Institute of the North American West and has organized a number of influential scholarly conferences. I heard that he was supposed to be going to Bavaria back in March for a conference, so really worldwide. He's authored and edited 10 books, published more than 50 articles and essays, and presented more than 50 professional papers. He has testified before Congress on a number of occasions and serves as an expert witness for Native American tribes, the U.S. Department of Justice, and for states. And we are lucky to have him living, I believe, up Wolf Creek outside of Winthrop here in our great valley. He has just finished writing his latest paper, so it might be 51 papers now, Richard, and shared that with me earlier in the week, which is going to kind of lead this discussion. And that paper is on demography and the Sinixt. So first I want to start off with, what is demography, Richard?
Demography is the study of population change, usually among a specific people.
Okay, and in this case, those specific people are the Sinixt. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
The Sinixt are one of the 12 confederated Colville tribes. Their territory was was on the Columbia River between Kettle Falls and above Revelstoke in Canada. Just above the international boundary today, the Columbia River turns into first lower Arrow Lake and then upper Arrow Lake. Those are long, narrow, deep lakes along the channel of the Columbia. And that was the main portion of the river where the people lived, although they did have a number of rather large winter villages between Kettle Falls and the international border. They were hunting people. They did have, at Kettle Falls, they did have a pretty big salmon fishery, but they're really focused on hunting. Because their terrain is so rugged, they didn't they didn't adapt to the horses as much as some of their neighbors. They're interior Salish, so they're related and speak a somewhat similar language to the Methow who lived in our valley.
Great, and can you give us a little bit of the history and maybe the reason behind you doing this research and writing this paper?
So the basic history of the people I'll outline quickly. They probably numbered at least 3,000 in the mid 18th century. Disease by at least the 1770s, disease had reduced the population to a small percentage of what it once was. By the time they moved to the Colville Reservation, the population may have been as low as 400. They were great hunters as I said, and trappers. And so they had lost so much population when the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company and the other fur traders came on the scene beginning in 1811. They became important trading partners with the fur companies. They needed guns for hunting, for subsistence, and of course, the beaver pelts were very valuable to the traders. The disease continued to come through the area, and there was even more loss of life from the late 18th century to the mid 19th century. And then gold and silver were discovered up in the area, and it brought in an influx of miners and prospectors, and a number of people were killed by white people. So beginning in the 1860s, a large number of the Sinixt moved down across the international boundary and moved onto or adjacent to the Colville Reservation after it was established in 1872. A number of Sinixt did remain in British Columbia. A lot of them intermarried with other bands. And as you all probably know, there was a treaty between the United States and Canada about doing hydropower on the Columbia River. And in 1956, as dams were being planned for the Columbia River, hydropower dams that would eventually provide a very large portion of the electricity for all of British Columbia. When they were planning those dams, the government declared the Sinixt extinct. And it may have been in order to avoid having to consult with them about the building of the dams. This has been that was a very moving and hurtful thing for the Sinixt people, to have a government declare them extinct, and they have fought ever since to change that decision. I began working on this, I think, about 10 or 15 years ago. The tribe tried numerous ways to get into court in order to see if they could get the government to admit they weren't extinct. Finally, a prominent member of the Sinixt tribe, Richard Hart, went up and killed an elk in his traditional territory, and then called BC, British Columbia Fish and Game, and informed them of his GPS coordinates and asked if he could be cited. He had let them know in advance that he was going to be up there hunting. It took them 4 days, as I recall, to get up there and give him a citation, but we finally got into court. The trial was held, I believe, in 2016, and then in 2017 we finally got a decision from the judge, and the judge, very good decision, declared that they not only were not extinct, but that they had Aboriginal rights in their traditional territory. That has now been on appeal. It's been through 2 courts, which those courts strengthened the decision, and it's now before the Canadian Supreme Court. The pandemic has delayed the decision from the Canadian Supreme Court, but we're pretty confident that the court will affirm the lower court's decision. So when that comes through, then the tribe will seek further clarification of their Aboriginal rights and try and determine through a regular Canadian land claim the extent of their Aboriginal territory and the extent of their rights in that territory. So one of the questions that comes up is, if the tribe is claiming a territory, did they have a sufficient population to actually protect that territory? And did the territory have sufficient resources to provide subsistence in a long-term period for the tribe? So that's one of the reasons why demography, the population, becomes extremely important. In Canadian law, the key period is 1811, the point of contact, David Thompson, to the point of sovereignty, 1846, when the Treaty of Oregon was signed between Great Britain and the United States. So what we're trying to look at is, and trying to determine, is what was the territory and what was the population between 1811 and 1846.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, how interesting is that? The culture, the history, and then the politics as they intertwine. And it looks like my internet maybe is a little unstable, so hopefully you can still hear me. Am I coming through, Richard?
I can hear you, yes.
Great. So one of the questions that comes up for me is that we know that there were diseases before 1811, and can you kind of go through when were some of the waves of diseases and what impact did that have on the demography of the Sinixt specifically, but also, I guess, our region in general?
Yes, so it's important to realize that there has been a big controversy over the population of Native peoples in the Americas. It has been to the benefit of colonial interests to say that there was a low population. There are people that have actually said the population was lower at contact than it was after contact, that the contact allowed the tribes to increase in population. And this, of course, benefited those who didn't want to see any land claims or litigation from the tribes, especially in recent years. On the other hand, estimating high population could benefit the tribes, especially in regard to litigation. So there's been a deep division between scholars over what the pre-contact and contact population of the tribes was. The first person to really study the matter was a guy named James Mooney, who was a United States ethnologist, and he estimated in the beginning of the 19th century, he estimated in the beginning of the 20th century, that's when he was alive, he estimated the population at contact of North America was about 1 million. That estimate was maintained by important anthropologists in the United States through the 1930s. A famous anthropologist by the name of Alfred Kroeber in the 1930s estimated the population at about 1 million. Then in the 1960s, after the Indian Claims Commission and ethnologists really started to study the matter and to take into account Indian reports and to try and analyze the reports that had been left in documentary sources. Another anthropologist by the name of Henry Dobbins estimated that the population was much greater in North America, about 18 million people. Today, estimates are usually somewhere in between the 1 million and 18 million, but almost everybody, I think today, would estimate that the North American population was somewhere between 3 and 5 million, at least. In terms of disease, there was one great pandemic that is very well documented that began in what is now Mexico City in 1518, not long after Columbus's arrival. And that pandemic lasted for 7 years to 1525. And some anthropologists and demographers like Dobbins and others believe that this pandemic that reached across both continents of the Americas reduced the population of the Americas by maybe 75 to 95%, and that this depopulation was the beginning of the great depopulation that occurred, which first in our area began to be documented in the around 1800. So there are those who say that who conclude in my opinion, on the basis of a lack of any reports in the 17th century that there were no epidemics in this region, and that the first major epidemic to depopulate the region was the smallpox epidemic of the 1770s. All of the experts today, I think, will agree that the population of all the tribes in the Pacific Northwest the population was reduced by from 75 to 95%. They don't agree when that occurred, but by 1800, by 1811, when the first Europeans entered this region, the population was almost certainly at least 75% lower, and probably, in my opinion, 95% lower than it had once been. So all of the reports of the first white people that meet Indians in this region are talking about tribes that for at least a century have had reduced population, perhaps as long as 200 or 300 years. They had been dealing with trying to deal with the lack of subsistence. And so that's sort of the basic outline. The tribes in our area, I think we can say that the Methow, there's no question that they had lost at least 75%, maybe 95% of their population. The Sinixt over on the Columbia River similarly had lost 75 to 95% of their population. And it becomes, of course, very important to try and determine what the pre-contact population was, both, and archaeology comes into play with this, because it's also a question of whether they had population to sustain themselves and to protect their territory. We know who their neighbors are, and we know that their neighbors also had reduced population, and we know that there were some battles between some of the tribes in around the time of contact, but we're still learning the extent of those battles and the extent of the population change, and we're yet to determine for sure the extent of the boundaries for the various tribes.
Thank you for that quick dive into a deep and sort of dark history. That actually changes my way of thinking about how long ago disease was here and how it affected the native populations in a way that makes it almost impossible for us to understand what this place was like back in the 1500s or the 1600s. A quick follow-up question on that would be, so in your, say you're providing some testimony, I imagine that may happen again on the Sinixt. How do you estimate that sort of original population? Because we know that at contact, what you're saying is that at contact in 1811, the population was already reduced by 75 to 95%. So how do you estimate and justify an original population, for lack of a better word?
What I tried to do was to look at both the conservative estimates and the large estimates, and look at how the various people, the various demographers and anthropologists arrived at their conclusions. And then I estimated, using all of those models and formulas, I estimated Sinixt population from the point at which we know the population. We know what the population was in about 1870. We know there were 200 or 300 people in Canada and 200 or 300 people in the United States. So if we're looking at, 400 to 600 in 1870, what might it have been in 1846, and what might it have been in 1811? And I concluded that before point of contact, before the first epidemic in 1770 or in 1550, 1520, depending on which you believe, the population must have been at least 3,000. I think that's a conservative estimate based on I think that would coincide with the most conservative estimates made by demographers and would be a low figure to the most liberal estimates. I'm thinking about what can stand up in court, so I want it to be sufficiently conservative that it can't be attacked too much.
Great. And do you have, off the top of your head, do you have the numbers roughly for the Methow people?
Yeah, I think similarly, they would be at least 3,000, perhaps a little 3 to 4,000, depending on whether you believe, 75 to 95% were reduced. One of the questions that needs to be answered is relates to archaeology. There is quite a bit of archaeology left on the plateau. In pre-contact times, most of the peoples lived in various different kinds of pit houses, and a lot of archaeologists now will estimate the density of population, both in the pit houses, how many people could actually live in a pit house, and for territorial. So if you have a number of pit houses in each village and you have a certain number of villages, you can estimate, people have estimated the density for the whole territory and also for the pit houses. So, but there isn't enough archaeological work done yet. A lot of archaeology has been destroyed. So a lot of times the tribes had the most advantageous sites for their villages, and those sites now have been taken up for various reasons by non-Indians. Also, like in the Sinixt territory, importantly, most of their main villages along the Columbia were inundated by the hydroelectric dams that were constructed in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. So the few places where there are archaeological sites left, we have to try and figure out, are they representative or non-representative? And then, so there's a lot of archaeological work yet left to do. There are some areas on the Kettle River and on Slocan Lake where there's quite a bit of archaeology left, but one of the questions is, are these representative or not representative of what the other villages that are inundated might have looked like?
Yeah, so some of the challenges of these studies is, of course, the data that you're using to draw conclusions and its robustness.
Right, right. And I think there's quite a bit of work that is yet to be done that can be done in our valley too. I've worked before in the Southwest where the people had pottery, and so there are a lot of material remains from past villages and past life. Up here, a lot of what the people used deteriorates naturally in the ground, and so there isn't quite as much left. But pit houses can be examined, and you can figure out how many people were living there and how much debris was left and what they were eating. I found it really interesting that one of the Sinixt pit houses in the Slocan Valley indicated that the people were eating a lot of beaver, which didn't sound like a great diet to me, but why not?
I know I've never had beaver. Maybe we can ask someone who has what it tastes like.
Yeah.
One of the things just to give a little plug for the Interpretive Center, we do have, and I know you know this, Richard, we have a Methow Artifact Research Project, which is led by another Rich Davis. And so we welcome anybody who finds artifacts on their land to contact us, and they can be donated to the Interpretive Center. We work with the tribes to make sure it's done right, or you can keep it yourself and we can just take some measurements, take some photographs, and Rich and other archaeologists will attempt to create some of these stories you're talking about, Richard, through the artifacts we're finding here in our valley. So if anybody finds any, please contact the Interpretive Center if you're willing to show it or share it or give it to us.
Yeah, that's that's very true, and it's very important. A very important project. It's exceptionally important for people who find objects to document where they were found, so there is proper provenance or provenience. I helped somebody who found a hearth with some grinding stones down in the Twisp area that called the tribe. The tribe came over, documented where they were, took pictures of them, and I believe the owner of the property kept the implements. So that's really important when you eventually someday will have a much better picture of where people lived and what they used and what they ate. And all of this, everything that's found by people in the community can be helpful in determining those questions, the answers to those questions.
Wonderful. Just want to kind of back to disease. I'm looking at your book, Lost Homeland, about our area in the Methow tribe, and just want to share with any viewers that it looks like we knew that there were major smallpox epidemics, although other diseases as well, in the plateau region in 1782 to 83, 1800, 1825, 1830 to 1832, 1846 to 1847, 1852 to 1853. And you write in here that the 1782 to 83 scourge destroyed as much as 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. And I know when I was reading this book, that hit me very viscerally just to think about, and that was before coronavirus, how the people here, our neighbors, our friends in the native populations were affected. And now you're saying, no, it probably happened even longer, a couple centuries before that. It's quite a chilling story.
Right. And it's good to try and imagine what it would be like for the people. I mean, they had never met Europeans. They may have heard stories about Europeans, but the earliest smallpox epidemics, I mean, Europeans for generations, even centuries and maybe millennia, had been developing resistances to these diseases like smallpox. But even with those resistances, it took until there was a vaccine before smallpox ceased to be so deadly to Europeans. But the Native Americans had no resistance, none whatsoever, just like we all have no resistance today to the coronavirus. And as a result, there was huge loss of life. Now, as of about 1800, vaccine was available, but Europeans did not regularly provide it to native populations. The Spanish government provided some inoculation to tribes in the Southwest when those people were near European settlements, and it was really to protect the European settlements that they vaccinated the Indians. The same was true in the early 18th century over in Vancouver Island. Some of the native populations were vaccinated when they were close to white populations. The Indians, the Sinixt and the Methow, did not get vaccinations. The Catholic priests at the mission over by Colville did offer vaccinations to Indian peoples if they converted. So that was one of the incentives of the Colville people to move down to the vicinity of or to the Sinixt people to move down to the vicinity of the Colville Reservation. We see even in the middle of the 19th century smallpox epidemics that don't reach the white population because they're vaccinated and do rush through and depopulate the native populations. So in my opinion, the fact that we don't have anybody here in the 17th century or the early 18th century to report on what the diseases were like is not sufficient proof that there were no diseases. I think it's I think it's more likely that there were epidemics, that the waves of epidemics that came through uh, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries.
And
And my look at the documentary record suggests that in terms of the tribe's resistance to smallpox, especially, every second generation they became almost completely uh, non-resistant. So sometimes when there's a smallpox epidemic, the next generation, the kids don't seem to get it, but the generation after that, the second generation, uh, they're vulnerable to the smallpox and the other diseases. And so you see wave after wave of disease come through. And it must have been really terrible for the people to have a huge percentage of their, I mean, we're really worried about a small percentage of the overall population. And it is terrible, of course, seeing how many people are dying in the United States and around the world. But think about what it must have been like to see 50, 60, 70% of everybody that you know dying of the same disease. There's nothing whatsoever you can do about it. You don't even know where it came from or what it is. So that's kind of what I think the disease must have been like to the native peoples.
yeah, and I think a lot about that too, and maybe wrong, but just thinking about how sometimes diseases don't seem to pick and choose. And so a disease coming through, maybe wiping out elders, young, but also those that were out hunting for the tribe, those that were out gathering for the tribe. And what happens when it wipes out all your hunters? What happens when it wipes out all of your kind of middle-aged folks? And it just makes me realize how awful it must have been and how difficult to survive as a family or a tribe or a band.
Oh, that's very true. And subsistence, of course, traditionally, for instance, with hunting, you might have a communal hunt where most of the villagers would go out and help drive game into a drive lines, and a couple of people with bows and arrows at the where the drive fences met could dispatch enough deer to feed the whole community. When 75% of the community is gone, you can no longer do that. You don't have the human power to conduct all the activities you need to do. And that's one of the reasons why guns became so important, where you might have had to have several hundred people going out on a communal hunt. One person with a gun, with a musket and ball and powder, could go out and 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 successfully hunt a deer or another large animal. Among the Sinixt and other tribes in the region, there still are strong traditions that a hunter should never ever shoot an animal and wound it. You should only kill an animal with one shot. In fact, the Sinixt say that when you go hunting for a deer, you should only take one bullet. And the reason being, you've got to be really careful to not harm the meat and to not wound the animal and have the animal run off. I think also it illustrates the problem that the tribe had with the United States. The United States had this paranoid view that tribes would use ammunition to kill white people. And when they were all hunters, when their trade that had gone on for a couple of centuries with or at least one good century with the Hudson's Bay Company and the other fur companies, they ammunition was expensive, but it was important for hunting. The very first order that Governor Stevens, the first United States governor of Washington, the territory of Washington, the first order he made was to order that Indians could no longer, you could no longer trade ammunition and powder with the Indians. And they weren't worried about attacking the whites, they were worried about eating. So it became a big problem. Wanted to go back and mention another thing about the studies that have gone on about about demography and the Indians of the Northwest. In the early days, by early I mean the early 20th century, uh, those people that were historians and anthropologists that were writing about disease in the Northwest, one of the things they said was that disease was a benefit to the white people because it killed the Indians and allowed the white people to settle in their territory without having to fight them, which is pretty, we might object to today, but that was a common belief 100 years ago.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. One other thing that I want you to speak on is about, I guess maybe shifting to this day, this year here in our valley and also on the reservation. And I want you to speak a little bit about how coronavirus, I guess, is affecting us all, how it's maybe different than what we've seen in the past. And also, please speak specifically about how it is being perceived on the reservation.
Well, first of all, on the reservation, I think one of the problems that exists is that Indian people tend not to trust white people. I mean, white people have lied to them their whole lives. And oftentimes when I start to know, especially elderly Indian people, they explain how they never have trusted any white people, and and they have good reason, because white people have lied to them. Government has lied to them. The officials of the government on the reservation have lied to them, and so they don't trust white people. And so one of the problems that has been with the coronavirus is that is Indians not trusting the advice that they're getting about social distancing and masks and so forth. And I think it's one of the things that the tribal government has worked really hard on, is to convince the people that this is basically another white person's disease that has the potential of really devastating their population, and they need to follow the advice and have social distancing and stay home and wear masks. I think that's happening now. It took some time, but it's the same for us. I think it's all this. We have no resistance to this disease, so it's really important. I mean, we can learn from history. We can see what's happened to populations in the past that didn't have resistance to a disease, a new disease, and I think we just have to be very careful and prudent in how we treat each other, and staying home and keeping social distancing and wearing masks. All these things, I think they're important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know that's how this whole conversation actually kind of started between us, was that you had received a request from some tribal members to try to share some information to encourage tribal members to do social distancing and wear masks and take care of themselves.
Right. And I actually got those requests from more than one tribe, and the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, I got a request from them. It's particularly difficult for them because they have clans and they have a lot of they have a lot of curing societies. And when somebody's sick, the tradition is that they should, that as many people from a curing society or a clan should visit them and comfort them and pray for them as possible. And it's very difficult for them to have somebody tell them, well, your religion doesn't work and you've got to stay away. And so that was one of the things that I was asked, I mean, to talk to them about the past history of a disease among their people and the effects of disease. And one of the things I said was, well, you know, this disease is not from your world, it's from another world. It's from the white world and the European world. And so it may be that your religion is not completely satisfactory, and so you have to use some of these other techniques to help prevent it from spreading. But it's a difficult question for all the tribes to determine. I mean, some of the tribes in the Southwest, for instance, some people thought that when somebody got sick, you should stay away from them, and that maybe burn all of their possessions when they had if they died, and those people tended to increase in population, while those people that tended to uh, offer a lot of condolences and spend a lot of time with the sick spread the disease, and many more people died. So it's almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, and I think it brings up a bit of a poignant point of connection that many of us too here in the Methow Valley in the past, when we've responded to difficult situations like the Carlton Complex fire and the Okanagan Complex fire, it was the gathering together of the community that felt so strengthening. And here we are in a situation where we want to come together to help each other, but we can't. And so what do we do to support each other and to be a community in this strange time?
That's right. That's a good point. I'm encouraged by seeing all of the women that are and people that are sewing masks and distributing masks. It's an important activity. It's too bad the government hasn't provided sufficient masks for everybody. But and down there at Twistworks, I know Jonathan at Equipped is pumping out hundreds, if not thousands, of masks now.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see people being creative and helping one another in the ways they can. And sometimes that is just staying away from other people too. And
That's
I
right.
think it's important to view that as a really a strong act of compassion.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
well, as we kind of conclude our interview, Richard, is there anything else? I guess, yeah, maybe one last question I have is, can we try to bring it back to a real personal level? Throughout your studies or your interactions with Native Americans, do you have oral histories or personal stories about how disease in the past has affected people or how it's currently affecting them?
Yeah. One of the stories that I've heard most recently relates to this what we call the Spanish flu of 1918, and this is something people on the reservation remember really clearly. And by that point in time, they really had come to the conclusion that these diseases came from white people, were delivered to them by white people. Uh, and so, and they thought that they identified the train. There used to be a more regular train that came up the valley from Wenatchee. And I'm told that back around 1918, when people started to get sick and died, there was a great loss of life on the reservation from the 1918 flu epidemic. That the elder women would dress in black and go stand by the station where the train came in and turn their backs to the train every time the train came up. So, I mean, it's really hard to imagine the impact that disease has had on the tribes. On the other hand, I think it's important to point out that the tribes are still here. Despite everything that's happened, here they are. They're still here. And that's encouraging.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time to talk about this important topic. And I really want to thank you for all the work you are doing to advocate for tribes, bringing this important historical information to them, to the courts, to books, to the general population. It's really important to remember this stuff as best as we can.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for all the work that MVIC is doing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I guess just to wrap up, we hope that we will have in-person last Sundays starting next month. I believe it is May 31st. We've got Julie Hovis lined up to speak about birds and bird banding. If that has to be recorded, we may need to shift gears, just like we did this month. Please also look for, I just created a YouTube channel yesterday. It took me 19 hours to upload my first 1 gigabyte video. I don't know why it took so long. And it's a recording of me out talking about flowers. Please pardon how stiff I was during that one. I promised to relax a little bit on future recordings, but I plan to do those probably once a month, if not sooner. So please look for some of our electronic virtual internet offerings, but then again, remember that we really are about community and kind of warm hand to warm hand. So when we can do that, we will be gathering as we have for decades now. Okay.